فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hey everyone, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary podcast. So for today, I want to continue our commentary on the chapter of Mary, Surat Maryam. And now we are reaching the climax where Maryam is about to give birth and she'll have to go back to her people. She conceives, she becomes pregnant, and now she's about to give birth. So in verse 22, the Qur'an says, فَحَمَلَتْهُ فَانْتَبَذَتْ بِهِ مَكَانٍ قَصِيًّا. So she conceived him, and literally in Arabic, it's hamala, so meaning she is hamil, or the one who is pregnant, or actually carrying. So a pregnant woman in the Arabic language is a carrying person. She is carrying another life. And after she carries and starts to become pregnant with Maryam, she withdraws to a distant place. Now, a couple of things are really fascinating about this verse. Once again, we see the use of the verb intabada, or she withdraws. And as we discussed earlier, there is this idea of withdrawal. So if we look just a couple of verses earlier, that before she gets the message of the pending birth of Jesus, that it says, so once again, when Maryam is introduced in the chapter, Mary withdraws from her family to a place in the east. And when I was researching this particular verb within the Qur'an, I found that this was the only 2 times in the entire Qur'an that the verb is used. Now, this brings up to a larger theological as well as exegetical or tafsir commentary of the idea of hapaxes. And hapaxes are something I've become increasingly interested in, which is a fancy word of saying that this is the only time in the Qur'an that this word is used. Now, hapaxes can help us better understand the Qur'an's literary, rhetorical, and stylistic elements. So when a story is being mentioned, hapaxes often signal something extraordinary within the narrative, and that important event is about to occur. So we'll see that in this chapter of Maryam, there are a large amount of hapaxes, that this is the only chapter that has certain words in it. So this is one of them, in tabada. And we also see in the next verse, Makhad, that this is a pain, a child, labor pain that Maryam experiences. And hapaxes are important because if you think about, even in the English language or any language, that when someone uses a word that's generally not used in common everyday speech, people all of a sudden pay more attention. They're like, oh, wow, I never heard that word before. What does that word mean? And hapax, for example, is one of them. When I first read that or heard that word, I was like, whoa, sounds like a fancy word. And what does that actually mean? So hapaxes is a literary tool. So when the author or the narrator is speaking and they really want to draw attention to the reader or the listener, then they'll use a hapax. They'll say a particular word. And here we see that this particular verb is only used in the Qur'an to describe Maryam. And this is something we talked about before, that in the Qur'an and the Bible, there are certain images that we receive about these different biblical and Quranic figures. So for example, when you think of Moses or Musa, you think about the staff that he uses to part the Red Sea. When you think of Jonah or Yunus, you think about the whale and him being in the belly of the whale and then eventually being released. When you think of Ibrahim, you think about the sacrificial son and how he was trying to sacrifice his son, but his son eventually was saved. And here, in a similar way, this idea of withdrawal is really central to the story of Maryam, that she is consciously withdrawing from people in order to receive the divine insight and message. Now, the first time she withdraws is because Jibril is about to give her a message. He's about to tell her that she's going to have a child. And then she asks the question, how can I have a child when no man has touched me? So in this moment of isolation, of solitude, Jibril emerges and informs her And this represents the divine communication, that an angel will come and appear to Maryam and tell her what is about to occur. And this is, I believe, a larger theme within the Islamic tradition of khalwa, of being alone, that here now in the month of Ramadan, you have this idea of i'tikaf, of actually going and praying alone, but in a communal setting in the masjid or in the mosque. And you see this also, the idea of tahajjud, when people wake up at night when no one's watching. And it represents a sense of sincerity, that someone is truly worshiping God, not because of the audience or the gaze, but because they really believe in God and have faith. Now, once again, we see this word used, that when she begins to become pregnant, that she retreats and she becomes alone. So this is setting up the scene where she'll have Jesus, Isa, and she will be in a state of solitude, and she'll be in a position where she can once again receive the divine favors. Now, a question that emerges here is that why does she retreat once again? Now, one of the commentators, he mentions that this is because she starts to become pregnant. And as she becomes pregnant, it will obviously begin to show that after a couple of months, her belly would become larger. People will notice that she is going to give birth, and then they'll start asking questions. And she withdraws in this place for this reason, because she does want people to know what is about to occur. Another reason fits the idea of solitude, that once again, she is going alone. And just like, for instance, Muhammad was alone when he had the initial revelation, or Moses was alone when he had encountered the burning bush. In a similar way, Maryam has to be alone when she gives birth to Jesus. Now, we see a couple of fascinating stories that I mentioned. This is the Anbiya, or the stories of the prophets literature, that speak about the relationship of Maryam with the people around her, such as Elizabeth, who is the wife of Zechariah, and also that of Isa, Jesus, with that of Yahya, or John the Baptist, and Adam. So one of the stories is that as she became pregnant with Isa, that she would go and she would visit different people. And one of them was the wife of Zechariah, who is known to be Elizabeth in the biblical tradition. And when she would come to Elizabeth, Elizabeth would say, "Oh, what I have in my stomach is giving prostration to you. الذي في بطنها يسجد للذي في بطن مريم." So what is in her stomach is giving prostration to that of Maryam. And then this child, who is Yahya, or John the Baptist, is praising this other child and is submitting themselves to him. And in that time period, the commentator mentions, particularly Ibn Kathir, that the sujud, or the prostration, was that of respect, just like of Joseph. So think about in the Qur'an, Joseph has this dream, and this dream is that he sees 11 planets, the sun and the moon, they're all giving prostration to him. So this prostration is not that of worship, as we see in common times with Muslim communities, but this is a prostration of ihtiram, of respect. And just like God ordered the malaika, the angels, to prostrate to Adam. And now in contemporary times, in the contemporary Muslim culture and theology, as well as fiqh, or Islamic practice, we see that Muslims do not do this. So this is something that was found throughout time, but Muslims would not prostrate to a human being. So this story is unique because it shows how that Isa and Yahya are connected. So this story in many ways connects the two figures of Zechariah, and Maryam. Because as we discussed earlier, Zechariah is going to have a child with Yahya, and that his wife will become pregnant. And relatively the same time, we have Maryam becoming pregnant. So this creates a bond between Maryam and Zechariah, and Maryam and Elizabeth, the wife of Zechariah, that they're all going to have a child and a son at the same time. However, there is a hierarchy. So just like how certain commentators like Qurtubi ranks Maryam above that of Zechariah, in a similar way, we see that many commentators and narrators, they see that Jesus, Isa, is greater than Yahya or John the Baptist. So even though they're being born at the same time, Yahya, when he comes close to that of Isa, he prostrates himself. And Elizabeth herself realizes this, that my child is actually in prostration to your child. And this shows that even though both of them are considered prophets and both of them are considered righteous people, and both of them were born around relatively the same time, they're almost siblings in a sense. However, the Isa or Jesus is the superior prophet, and that Yahya and John will actually go and be a supporter of Isa in his life. We also see another fascinating story, that of Yusuf or Joseph the carpenter. Now, if you look at the Quranic narrative, there is no mention of Joseph. And this is something when I go and speak to biblical audiences, especially those from a non-Muslim background, they will say, well, where's Joseph? Because Joseph is in biblical history and traditions, he's engaged with that Maryam. But if you look at the chapter of Maryam, you see that Joseph is not mentioned at all. And if you say the name Yusuf or Joseph, most Muslims will think about the prophet Yusuf. They won't think about Maryam and her fiancé. So we have this interesting story within the Quranic lore, as well as in the stories of the prophets, that talks about Yusuf al-Najjar or Joseph the carpenter. So we see that Maryam is the protagonist in the chapter of Maryam, that she's not mentioned first, Zechariah is. However, Maryam emerges, and there are most verses in the chapter about her. And there's no mention of Joseph, and I believe that reason is because to highlight her role, and that she herself was the recipient of the divine command and the one who gave birth. So in this particular story, Joseph and Najjar, or the carpenter, he was walking with Maryam, and both of them used to serve the masjid or the mosque. And there was no one more that worked harder and no one who was more devout than both of them. And then all of a sudden, Joseph, he begins to see that she becomes pregnant. And then Joseph becomes confused. And every time he wants to say something, he thinks about how righteous she is and how devoted. And then he's always been around her, and he doesn't see her doing anything that would be viewed as promiscuous. And then all of a sudden, he develops an idea. Instead of directly confronting her, he comes to her and asks her in a roundabout way. And then he says to her, Maryam, tell me, is it possible that a plant could grow without any seed, or that a tree could grow without any water? And how is it possible that a child could emerge without any male? And then Maryam understands, right? She understands what Joseph is trying to say. And she says, yes, I know that God has the ability to raise out agriculture, just like he created the heavens and earth without any seed, and that he created trees. And initially there was no water. And this was all by his power and his majesty. And Joseph, he says, yeah, I know, I understand that God has power and he has the ability to do all things. But I'm asking, God has power, but at the same time, he says, kun fayakun, be as it is. And then Maryam understands and tries to convince her, make him cognizant through a different metaphor. And she says, well, don't you know that God created Adam and his wife without any male or female? And eventually Yusuf says, yes, you're right. Just like Adam was created without any male or female, in a similar way, a child could be created without any father. So this is an important story because it speaks to this idea that's found in the Qur'an, that both Isa, Jesus, is similar to that of Adam. Adam didn't have a father and he didn't have a mother, but he was created. And this speaks to the Islamic idea that Jesus didn't have a father, right? That in different notions, in Christian notions, for instance, that God is the father and God his son is that of Jesus. But in the Islamic story and the narrative, and as we see here, Jesus is more like that of Adam. Adam, or the Islamic tradition, would not say that God is the father of Adam. Rather, God created Adam and also his wife, Hawa, or Eve, and both of them are created out of nothing and eventually came to being. And in a similar way, Jesus, Isa, is a miracle, and he was born without a father. So we see here that the Qasas al-Anbiya, the stories of the prophets, literature, they find a way for Joseph. They see him in the biblical tradition, and when they read the Qur'an, they don't see him at all. He's absent. However, Joseph plays an important role as a righteous person, someone who works with Maryam, devoted to the temple. However, he asks a question that many people would have, but he asks this in a respectful way. As we'll see later, many of the people, they mock Maryam. They mock her and say, how could you have done such a thing? However, Joseph is a righteous individual, and he doesn't go down that path. He doesn't mock Maryam. He doesn't question her piety or her devoutness to God. Rather, he asks in a roundabout way, how could this be possible? And then Maryam, realizing the crux of his question, emphasizes that God is all-powerful and has the ability to do anything, and then makes the comparison between her child, Isa, Jesus, with that of Adam, that both of these prophets are seen as unique individuals and people who have a divine mission. So to conclude, we see once again this parallel with Zechariah. That Zechariah, when he is going or asking for a child, he asks in nida and khafiya. So he asks in a secret or a hidden way. He doesn't go out into the temple and start screaming. Rather, he is shy about this, and he is in a state of solitude. And in a similar way, we see this once again appear with Maryam. When Maryam hears the command that she will have a child, she's by herself. She's not with anyone else. She's only there with Jibreel. And then later, when she's about to have Isa or Jesus as a child, she also is quiet. Right? She's also silent. And she's also alone, that she removes herself from other people. This could be, once again, based on the idea that she didn't want anyone to know, and they would see her getting pregnant and then question her honor. However, a more deeper and spiritual understanding is that moments of divine connection happen when someone is alone and by themselves, that there is no one else around. And we see this idea of a hapax, that now as we're reaching the climax of the story, we see certain words that are using that are not found anywhere else in the Qur'an. That even though that this chapter is understood to be an early chapter, emerging from the late Meccan era, there is no Medinan chapters that will come later that use this particular word. Now, this is a word that's found specifically in regards to Maryam, that she is by herself when she receives the divine command from Jibreel or Gabriel, and once again when she's about to give birth to Isa and Jesus. So the narrative, the Qur'an, is highlighting and pointing to the reader that something amazing and profound is about to occur. Thanks once again for listening to the Islamic Mary podcast. I encourage you to subscribe. Also encourage your friends, students, and colleagues to listen to the podcast, share with others on social media, as well as with your students. You can always email me, text me if you have any comments, suggestions, and ideas. You can review this podcast. I'm really fortunate that some of you already reviewed it and recommended it to others. And I encourage you to visit my website and to join my newsletter, where I'll be updating folks on the upcoming publication of the Islamic Mary book, Maryam Through the Centuries. I'm really happy to announce that the book will come out September 8th. Thanks so much. Take care and goodbye.